"Sir, would you be my dad?" The words came out as a whisper, thin and uncertain, almost lost in the cold night air. The billionaire stopped. Daniel Wright had been walking without purpose, hands buried deep in the pockets of his dark wool coat, his mind tuned out from the noise of New Year's Eve. Fireworks cracked above the river. Laughter rolled through the park in uneven waves. People were counting down to midnight with strangers who felt like family for one night. He was thinking of none of it. Then the voice reached him. "Sir, would you be my dad?" Daniel's body reacted before his mind did. His steps halted abruptly, as if he had run into an invisible wall. He turned slightly, convinced at first that he had misunderstood, that the words had been part of someone else's conversation. A joke shouted between friends, but when he turned fully, he saw her. A little girl stood a few feet away, her shoulders hunched against the cold. She couldn't have been more than 6. Her coat was worn at the cuffs, her knitted hat pulled too low, nearly covering her eyebrows. She clutched the strap of a small shopping bag with both hands as if it were an anchor. She did not smile. She did not wave. She just stood there, looking at him. "What?" Daniel said, too quickly. The girl flinched at his tone. Her fingers tightened around the bag. For a moment, she looked like she might turn and run. Instead, she swallowed hard and lifted her chin, forcing herself to speak again. Would you be my dad?" she asked, more quietly this time. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the kind that came when something unexpected threatened his carefully controlled world. He scanned the park instinctively, parents nearby, someone watching too closely, a setup he didn't yet understand. This was not the first time a stranger had approached him. People always wanted something once they recognized him. Money, attention, access. He looked back at the girl. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice, not unkind but firm. "You shouldn't be doing this." "I know," she said quickly. "I'm sorry." Her apology was immediate, practiced. That unsettled him more than anything else. "Where's your mother?" he asked. "At home," she replied. "I was just at the store." "Alone?" His eyebrows drew together. She nodded. "It's close. I work some." Daniel exhaled slowly. The countdown to midnight echoed faintly from another part of the park. 7 minutes. 6. "This isn't funny," he said, choosing his words carefully. "And it's not safe." Her eyes dropped to the ground. "I'm not joking." He studied her face again, looking for the signs he had learned to recognize over decades of negotiations. The rehearsed sadness, the calculated pause, the invisible adult pulling strings from the shadows. He saw none of that. Still, instinct warned him. "Look," Daniel said, straightening slightly, putting distance into his posture. "I don't know who put you up to this, but I'm not interested." Her head snapped up. "No one did. I've seen this before," he continued, his voice calm but guarded. "Kids sent ahead because people feel bad saying no. It's not fair to you." Her lips parted, then pressed together again. She shook her head, small and quick. "I'm not asking for money," she said. "That's usually what comes next," he replied. The words sounded harsher than he meant, but he did not take them back. He needed to be clear. He had learned, the hard way, that hesitation invited trouble. The girl's eyes filled not with tears, but with something quieter. Disappointment, maybe, or understanding. "I didn't think you would say yes right away," she said. Daniel frowned. "You didn't?" "No," she said softly. "I just needed to ask." Something in her tone gave him pause. "You think I'm lying," she added. Daniel hesitated. He did not deny it. "I think you're very young," he said instead. "And I think you're being used." She shook her head again, more slowly this time. "I thought you might think that." The honesty in her voice unsettled him. "Why?" he asked. She shifted her weight, her boots scraping lightly against the pavement. Fireworks burst overhead, briefly illuminating her face. In that flash of light, Daniel saw exhaustion there. Not the kind that came from missing sleep, but the kind that came from carrying worry too big for a child. "My mom is lonely," she said. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. "She doesn't say it." The girl went on, her words careful. as if she were stepping through fragile glass. "But I can tell. That's not something you can fix by asking strangers to be your father," Daniel said quietly. "I'm not fixing it," she replied. "I'm just trying to help." He studied her more closely now. The way she stood her ground without defiance. The way she kept her distance, respecting a boundary she had never been taught but somehow understood. "And why me?" he asked. She looked at him, really looked at him. "Because you stopped walking." Daniel blinked. "What?" "Everyone else walks fast tonight," she explained, "like they don't want to be alone when the year changes. You were walking slow, like you didn't mind." I don't frezzed. The observation struck deeper than he expected. "That doesn't mean anything," he said. "It meant something to me," she answered. Daniel felt the bench behind his knees and realized he had stopped moving again. He sat down, the cold metal seeping through his coat. "I'm not your dad," he said, more gently now. "And I can't be," she nodded. "I know. You don't even know my name." "That's okay. It's C." He looked at her. Truly looked. And for the first time that night, he did not feel like he was being evaluated or cornered. He felt asked. "What happens now?" he said. She took a small breath. "Now I go home. And your mom? I'll tell her I tried," she said. "That I talked to someone kind." The word landed softly, unexpectedly. Daniel glanced at his watch. 2 minutes to midnight. "Sit down," he said suddenly. She looked startled. "Sir, just for a minute," he clarified. "You don't have to say anything else." After a brief hesitation, she climbed onto the bench, leaving a careful space between them. Her feet swung gently above the ground, not touching. The countdown began nearby. 10, 9, 8. Daniel stared ahead, his thoughts loud and tangled. 3, 2, 1. The sky exploded with light and sound. Daniel did not cheer. He did not stand. He sat beside a child whose name he did not know, who had asked him for something he had sworn never to give again, and for the first time in years, he did not walk away when the year changed. The fireworks thinned into distant echoes, their light dissolving into a pale haze above the river. Around them, the park loosened its grip on celebration. Couples drifted away, arms still linked. Vendors packed up carts. The cold settled in. Quieter now, more honest. Daniel Wright remained on the bench. The little girl sat beside him, leaving a careful space, her legs swinging gently as if keeping time with thoughts she didn't say out loud. She watched the ground more than the sky, tracing invisible lines with the tips of her boots. "You should go home," Daniel said, not unkindly. She nodded at once. "Yes, sir." She slid down from the bench and took 2 steps, then stopped, as if remembering something important she hadn't finished. "I didn't tell you," she said, turning back. "But my mom worries if I'm late." Daniel stood. "Which way are you headed?" She pointed down a side street where the lamps were fewer and the buildings lower. "That way. It's close." He followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "I'll walk with you." Her eyes widened, just slightly. "You don't have to." "I know." She studied his face, weighing something, then gave a small nod. "Okay." They walked side by side. Daniel shortened his stride without thinking. The city felt different at this hour, less performative, more real. Paper confetti stuck to the sidewalk, damp and trampled. Somewhere, a radio played an off-key rendition of a song that had already outlived its moment. "What did you buy?" he asked, nodding toward the small grocery bag she carried. "Bread," she said, "and soup. The kind with chicken. Your mom's favorite?" She shook her head. "Mine. But she eats it anyway." Daniel almost smiled. They reached an intersection and waited for the light. The girl rocked gently on her heels, then looked up at him. "Sir," she said, hesitant again. "You thought I was lying, didn't you?" He didn't answer right away. The light changed. Cars rolled through, tires hissing on wet pavement. "I thought you might be sent," he said finally. "People do that sometimes." She nodded as if this confirmed something she already knew. "I thought you might think that." "Why?" "Because you looked careful," she said. "Careful people don't believe things easily." Was echoing. Daniel felt the observation land, precise and unexpected. They crossed the street, A few steps later, he asked, "What's your name?" She stopped walking, turned to him fully. For a moment, her face tightened, guarded. "You didn't ask before," she said. "No," he admitted. "I should have." She searched his eyes, then relaxed. "It's Annie." "Annie," he repeated, testing the sound. It fit better than he expected. "I'm Daniel." She nodded. "I know." He blinked. "You do?" She pointed to his coat pocket. Your card was sticking out a little. He let out a short breath, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Fair enough. They reached the building, a narrow, brick structure with chipped steps and a tired front door. A single light glowed inside the lobby, warm but dim. "This is us," Annie said. Daniel looked up at the building, then back down at her. "Your mother, what's her name?" Annie hesitated, then said, "Ruth." "Ruth," Daniel repeated. The door opened before he could say more. A woman stood there, her hand still on the handle, concern etched deep into her face. She wore a sweater too thin for the season and had the kind of tired eyes that came from years of being responsible for everything. "Annie," she said, relief sharp in her voice. "Where have you been?" "I'm sorry," Annie said quickly. "I stopped in the park." The woman's gaze shifted to Daniel. Her posture changed instantly, shoulders squared, chin lifted. Not fear. Caution. "Who is this?" she asked. Daniel stepped back half a pace, keeping his hands visible. "Daniel," he said. "I walked her home." Ruth's eyes flicked to Annie, then back to him. "You shouldn't talk to strangers," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "I know," Annie said, "but he sat with me." That did not reassure Ruth. Daniel nodded. "You're right, and I'm sorry. She asked me a question, and I didn't think it was right to leave her alone afterward." It binding. Ruth studied him closely, assessing. The silence stretched. "What question?" she asked Annie. Annie glanced at Daniel, then at her mother. "I asked him if he would be my dad." The words hung in the air, heavier now in the narrow hallway. If this moment touched you, take a second to support the story. Like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your voice matters here. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Ruth's breath caught. "Annie, I didn't mean forever," Annie said quickly. "I just asked." Daniel cleared his throat. "She didn't do anything wrong," he said. "She was polite and brave." As Ruth's gaze hardened, not at her daughter, but at him. "Children don't ask things like that without a reason." "I know," Daniel said quietly. Another pause. Then Ruth stepped aside. "Come in." "It's cold." Daniel hesitated. "I don't want to intrude." "You already walked her home," Ruth replied. "You might as well warm up." The apartment was small but clean. The smell of soup lingered in the air. Annie set the grocery bag on the counter and shrugged out of her coat. "Thank you for walking her," Ruth said, her voice softer now. "I worry." "So do I," Daniel said, surprising himself with the truth of it. Ruth studied him again, then asked, "Why did you stay?" Daniel thought of the bench, the countdown, the way leaving had felt wrong. "Because she asked me to sit," he said. "And because I didn't want to be someone who walked away." Ruth nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Annie," she said, "go put the soup on." "Ah yes, ah yes." Annie obeyed, casting a quick look back at them before disappearing into the kitchen. Ruth met Daniel's eyes. "My daughter doesn't need saving," she said. "But she does need honesty." "I understand," Daniel replied. "I didn't promise her anything." Ruth exhaled. "Good." They stood there, two adults measuring a moment neither had planned for. From the kitchen, Annie called, "Mom?" "The soup's ready." Ruth glanced toward the sound, then back at Daniel. "Would you like some?" Daniel hesitated. Then, for the second time that night, he chose not to walk away. The soup tasted simple and honest. Chicken, noodles, carrots, cut a little unevenly. Daniel noticed these things the way he noticed balance sheets and contracts automatically, without judgment. He sat at the small kitchen table, his long legs tucked awkwardly beneath it, while Annie perched on a chair across from him. blowing carefully on each spoonful. Ruth moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, wiping the counter, rinsing the pot, glancing at the clock on the wall as if measuring something more than time. "You didn't have to stay," she said again, not looking at him. "I know," Daniel replied. That answer seemed to satisfy her more than any explanation would have. For a few minutes, only the sound of spoons against bowls filled the room. Outside, the city had settled into its after-midnight lull. A distant siren wailed and faded. Somewhere above them, someone laughed, the sound muffled through old walls. Annie broke the silence first. "Do you live alone?" she asked Daniel. Ruth stiffened slightly. "Annie, it's okay," Daniel said. He looked at the girl. "Yes, I do." Annie nodded as if confirming a theory. "I thought so." "And why is that?" he asked. "Because you didn't rush anywhere when the fireworks started," she said. "People who have somewhere to go always rush." Readily wide. Daniel felt the truth of it settle in his chest. Ruth set a clean dish towel on the counter and finally sat down across from him. "Annie sees more than she should," she said. "It's not something I encourage. I don't think it's something you taught," Daniel replied. Ruth studied him. "What do you do, Daniel?" He hesitated. Normally, that question came early, asked with interest or calculation. Here, it felt different. Smaller, more human. "I run a company," he said. "Technology." "O's." Ruth nodded once. "That explains the coat." Daniel glanced down at it, suddenly self-conscious. "It was a gift." Annie giggled softly. Ruth's gaze sharpened. "You're careful," she said. "I noticed that in the hallway." "I have to be," Daniel replied. "It's a habit." Ruth folded her hands together. "Careful men usually don't sit on park benches with strange children on New Year's Eve." Daniel met her eyes. "Careful men also don't like the way it feels to leave a child alone." It's not as in. The honesty hung between them, fragile but steady. Ruth exhaled slowly. "Annie lost her father before she was born," she said. "She's never known anything else." Daniel nodded, listening. "I don't talk about it much," Ruth continued. "I don't want her growing up thinking something is missing. But children know when something isn't there, whether you name it or not." Annie looked up from her bowl. "I'm not missing," she said quickly. Ruth reached over and brushed her fingers through her daughter's hair. "No, baby, you're not." Daniel watched the gesture, the familiarity of it. He thought of how empty his own hands had felt for years. "When Annie asks questions like that," Ruth said, turning back to him, "it scares people. They think she's being taught to manipulate." "I thought that," Daniel admitted. Ruth's expression did not change. "I know." Annie lowered her head, her voice small. "I didn't mean to be bad." You weren't," Daniel said immediately. "You were honest." Ruth closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Honesty can be dangerous," she said. "Especially for children." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I didn't promise her anything," he said. "I won't." "That's good," Ruth replied. "Because I won't let anyone stay in her life out of pity." Daniel met her gaze steadily. "Neither would I." Another silence settled, less tense now. Annie finished her soup and set the bowl aside with exaggerated care. "Mom," she said, "can Daniel stay until my story is done?" Ruth hesitated, then looked at Daniel. "She likes routines," she explained. "It helps her sleep." Daniel stood. "I don't want to impose." Ruth studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded toward the living room. "One story." Annie smiled, wide and unguarded, and hopped off her chair. The living room was small but warm, lit by a single lamp. Annie climbed onto the couch with her blanket while Ruth sat on the armrest. Daniel took the chair opposite them, his posture stiff, unsure of where to put his hands. Annie opened a worn picture book and began to read aloud, stumbling over some words, correcting herself patiently. Daniel listened, surprised by how much effort the simple act required from her and from him. When she finished, she looked up at him. "Did you like it?" "I did," he said. "Very much." She beamed. Ruth walked him to the door afterward. Annie lingered behind them, hugging her blanket. "Thank you," Ruth said quietly, "for not treating her like a problem." Daniel nodded. Thank you for letting me stay. At the door, Annie stepped forward. She held out her hand, small and warm. Good night, she said. Daniel took her hand carefully. Good night. As he stepped into the cold hallway, Ruth added softly, We don't need saving. Daniel turned back. I know. He left then, the sound of the door closing gentle, final. Outside, the city felt different, quieter, less sharp around the edges. For the first time in years, Daniel did not return home feeling like he had escaped something. He returned feeling like he had been invited. Daniel did not turn on the lights when he entered his apartment. The city spread out below his windows in a lattice of white and amber, distant and orderly, like something observed rather than lived in. He loosened his tie, set his keys down with deliberate care, and stood there longer than necessary, listening to the quiet hum of a space designed for one. For years, he had told himself this silence was peace. Tonight, it felt unfinished. He moved through the room slowly, as if expecting to hear something a child's voice, the scrape of a chair, the soft clink of a spoon against a bowl. Nothing answered him. The apartment remained exactly as he had left it before the fireworks, before the bench, before a question he hadn't known how to refuse. Would you be my dad? Daniel poured himself a glass of water and sat at the edge of the kitchen counter. His reflection stared back at him in the darkened window. Older than 40, for the first time. Lined by years he had learned to manage, but never to share. He had done the right thing. He repeated that to himself the way he repeated numbers during negotiations. He hadn't encouraged the child. He hadn't offered false hope. He hadn't crossed a line. And yet, he reached into his coat pocket and felt the crease where his business cards usually rested. Empty. He had given one away without thinking, like a man forgetting the value of something he had guarded for years. Sleep came late and shallow. He dreamed of benches and counting voices, of fireworks that exploded without sound. When he woke, it was already morning, pale and reluctant. January light filtered through the glass, colder than the night before. Daniel showered, dressed, and went to work. The office buzzed with its usual first day of the year energy assistants, moving quickly, executives shaking hands, the unspoken pressure of resolutions and expectations. His presence shifted the air as it always did. People straightened, voices lowered. Good morning, Daniel. Happy New Year. He nodded, returned greetings, moved forward. In the boardroom, projections flickered onto the screen. Numbers climbed. Futures were discussed in percentages and margins. Daniel listened, asked precise questions, made decisions that would ripple outward in ways most people would never see. Still, his mind drifted. A small kitchen, unevenly cut carrots, a child who noticed who rushed and who didn't. By mid-morning, he found himself staring at the same line of text for the third time. Daniel? His chief operating officer said gently. He blinked. Sorry. Go on. At lunch, he declined invitations and ate alone, a habit no one questioned. He scrolled through emails, paused, then opened his browser and typed in the address from memory. He hadn't meant to remember it. He simply did. The building appeared on the screen, flat and unremarkable. He closed the window immediately. Across town, Ruth stood at her kitchen sink, staring into a mug that had long since gone cold. Annie sat at the table, coloring carefully, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. She had not mentioned the man again. That, more than anything, unsettled Ruth. You're quiet, Ruth said. Annie shrugged. I'm thinking. About what? About grown-ups, Annie replied. Ruth smiled faintly. They're confusing. Annie nodded solemnly. Yes. Ruth watched her daughter for a long moment, then glanced at the business card resting face down beside the fruit bowl. She had not thrown it away. She told herself it meant nothing. Children asked questions. Adults answered them. Life went on. And yet, when she picked Annie up from school that afternoon, she noticed her daughter scanning the sidewalk, her gaze lingering just a second longer than usual. Did you have a good day? Ruth asked. Yes, Annie said. Then, after a pause, he didn't promise anything. Ruth stopped walking. What? She asked carefully. The man, Annie said. He didn't promise. That's good, right? Ruth crouched down in front of her, meeting her eyes. "Yes," she said firmly. "That's very good. It is not common." Annie seemed relieved. That evening, Daniel left his office later than usual. The city was quieter now, stripped of its celebration, returning to routine. He drove without music, hands steady on the wheel. He passed the park without meaning to. The bench was empty. Daniel slowed, then pulled over. He told himself he was just stretching his legs, just breathing cold air. The park smelled different in daylight, less magic, more truth. He sat on the same bench, the metal biting through his coat. He imagined her feet swinging, not touching the ground. He imagined standing up and leaving again. Instead, he stayed until the light faded. Back at the apartment, his phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. He let it ring twice before answering. Yes, there was a pause on the line, a breath. "This is Ruth," a woman said. "Annie's mother." Daniel straightened instinctively. "Yes, she wanted me to call," Ruth continued. "Not because she expects anything, because she wanted to say thank you." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "You didn't have to." "I know," Ruth said. "But children don't like unfinished things." Neither, he thought, did he. "She asked me to tell you," Ruth added, "that she slept well." Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. "I'm glad." Another pause, less guarded now. "She's not looking for a hero," Ruth said. "She's looking for truth." "So am I," Daniel replied quietly. When the call ended, the apartment felt different. Still quiet. Still empty, but no longer untouched. Daniel set his phone down and looked out at the city again. For the first time since his wife's death, he wondered not with fear, but with caution what it might mean to stay. Daniel did not plan to return. That was the truth he told himself as he drove past the apartment building the following evening, his eyes fixed on the traffic light ahead, his hands steady on the wheel. He had already stayed longer than necessary, already crossed a line he had drawn years ago and learned never to step over again. He had a meeting in 30 minutes, a dinner after that, a calendar full enough to justify distance. The light turned green. Daniel drove on. 2 blocks later, he slowed, pulled to the curb, and cut the engine. He sat there for a long moment, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular. The city hummed around him, indifferent. Somewhere nearby, a bus hissed to a stop. A couple argued softly on the sidewalk. Life, uninterrupted. He exhaled, opened the door, and stepped out into the cold. The building looked the same as before, tired brick, narrow windows, a front door that never quite shut all the way. Daniel stood across the street, aware of how out of place he must look in his tailored coat and polished shoes. He did not cross immediately. Careful men don't believe things easily. He thought of that and shook his head once, almost amused. Inside, Ruth was folding laundry when the knock came. She froze. Annie looked up from the floor where she was arranging her books into careful stacks. "Mom?" Ruth listened. Another knock. Polite. Uncertain. Her first instinct was irritation. Life did not usually knock gently. Her second was caution. She wiped her hands on a towel and moved toward the door, positioning herself slightly in front of Annie without thinking about it. When she opened it and saw Daniel standing there, her expression shifted not to surprise, but to guarded recognition. "Hello," he said. "I'm sorry to bother you." Ruth studied him for a beat longer than necessary. "You didn't say you were coming." I didn't know if I should," he replied. That honesty earned him a fraction of space. She stepped aside. "Come in. It's cold." Annie gasped softly when she saw him. "You came back," she said. Not as an accusation, not as praise, as a fact. Daniel crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level. "I did," he said. "Is that all right?" She nodded, eyes bright but careful. "Yes." Ruth closed the door and folded her arms loosely. "What brings you back, Daniel?" He straightened. "I wanted to check in," he said. "After last night. Make sure I didn't leave anything unsettled." Ruth regarded him steadily. "We were fine, I know," he said, "but I wasn't." The admission hung between them. Ruth gestured toward the kitchen. "We're having leftovers. You can sit, if you like." Daniel nodded once. "Thank you." They moved with the quiet choreography of people unaccustomed to company. Annie set out an extra placemat with exaggerated care. Ruth reheated soup, the familiar smell filling the small space. Daniel removed his coat, folding it neatly over the back of a chair that had never been meant for guests like him. They ate. Conversation came in pieces. Annie talked about school, about a math problem she had solved on her own, about a classmate who never shared crayons. Daniel listened, asked questions, found himself genuinely interested. Ruth watched him closely. "You don't have children," she said, not as a question. "No," Daniel replied. "I was married once. We planned to. It didn't happen." Ruth nodded. "I'm sorry. So am I," he said, surprised by how easily the words came. Annie looked between them. "My dad didn't stay," she said suddenly. Ruth stiffened. "Annie, it's okay," Daniel said quietly. "He wasn't bad," Annie added. "He was just gone." Daniel nodded. "Sometimes people leave because they're afraid of staying." Annie considered that. "Are you afraid?" The question was simple. The answer was not. "Yes," Daniel said. She nodded, satisfied. After dinner, Annie gathered her books and settled on the couch. Ruth washed dishes, her movements slower now, thoughtful. Daniel stood awkwardly near the window, unsure of his place. "You don't have to hover," Ruth said without looking at him. "You can sit." He did. They watched Annie read quietly, her lips moving as she traced the words with her finger. Ruth dried her hands and turned to him. "I need to be clear," she said. "I won't let this become something it isn't." "I understand," Daniel replied. "I won't confuse her." "She's already confused," Ruth said gently. "She's a child." "What I won't allow is disappointment dressed up as hope." Daniel met her gaze. "Then let me be clear too. I'm not here to promise. I'm here to be present. If that stops being helpful, I'll step back." Ruth searched his face for a long moment. "Most men don't know how to say that," she said. "I've had practice," Daniel replied. At leaving, that earned a faint, unexpected smile. Later, as Annie prepared for bed, she lingered in the hallway, blanket draped over her shoulders. "Will you come again?" she asked Daniel. He crouched again, keeping his voice steady. "If your mom says it's okay." Annie looked at Ruth. Ruth nodded once. "We'll see." That was enough. Daniel left a little while later. The night air felt sharper, but his steps were lighter than before. He reached his car and paused, looking back at the building. For the first time, he did not feel like an outsider peering in. He felt like someone standing at the edge of something fragile, unsure, and real. And this time, he did not drive away wondering why he had stopped. Routine arrived quietly. It did not announce itself with promises or declarations. It slipped in through small, repeatable moments. Daniel's car appearing on the street at nearly the same hour each evening. Annie glancing toward the window without realizing she was doing it. Ruth setting out an extra mug before she caught herself. Daniel told himself it was temporary. He came twice that week, then a third time, unplanned. Each visit was modest. He never stayed late. He never brought gifts. He sat at the table, listened, asked questions, learned the shape of their days. On Thursday evening, Annie met him at the door holding a piece of paper. "I made this," she said, holding it up carefully. It was a drawing. 3 figures under a crooked street lamp. One tall, one medium, one small. Daniel studied it with exaggerated seriousness. "Is that me?" Annie nodded. "You sit like that." He laughed quietly. "I do?" "Yes," she said. "Like you're thinking." 2. Ruth watched from the kitchen, her expression unreadable. Daniel handed the paper back. "It's very good." Annie shook her head. "It's for you." He hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Yes." He accepted it then, folding it once with care and slipping it into his coat pocket as if it were something valuable. Because it was. That night, as he drove home, he kept glancing at the pocket where the paper rested, grounding him in a way spreadsheets never had. On Sunday morning, Ruth surprised herself by asking, "Would you like to walk with us?" The words were out before she could reconsider. Daniel looked up from his coffee, startled. "Where?" "The park," she said. "Annie likes to feed the birds." Annie beamed. "They remember people." Daniel smiled faintly. So do children. The park looked different in daylight, softer, less theatrical. Annie tossed crumbs with careful precision, narrating which birds were regulars and which were visitors. Daniel watched her crouch near the path, patient, attentive. He thought of his own childhood, structured, disciplined, measured by achievement. There had been no space for stillness like this. "Do you like birds?" Annie asked. "I don't think I ever asked myself that," he said. She nodded solemnly. "You should ask things. We come." Ruth glanced at him, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. Later, as Annie chased pigeons with determined enthusiasm, Ruth spoke. "She's growing attached," she said quietly. Daniel did not deny it. "So am I," Ruth exhaled. "That's what worries me." "It worries me too," he admitted. "But I don't think distance would make it safer." Ruth studied his face. "Most people leave when things start to matter." Daniel's voice lowered. "I already know what leaving costs." And, that evening, Annie fell asleep on the couch while Daniel read aloud from a library book she'd chosen. Her breathing slowed, her fingers still curled around the edge of the blanket. Ruth watched from the doorway, her chest tightening. "You don't have to carry her," she said softly. Daniel shook his head. "I want to." He lifted Annie carefully, her head settling against his shoulder with instinctive trust. The weight of her was small, but the responsibility felt immense. As he laid her down, she stirred slightly. "Don't go yet," she murmured, half asleep. Daniel froze. "I'll be right here," he said quietly, though he knew she couldn't really hear him. Outside the room, Ruth watched him straighten the blanket, adjust the lamp, step back with reverence. "You're careful," she said again later, handing him his coat. "I have to be," he replied. "She deserves that." Ruth hesitated. "So do you." The words surprised them both. Daniel walked to his car under a sky heavy with clouds. For the first time, the thought of rain didn't bother him. At home, he placed Annie's drawing on his desk, propped carefully against a stack of reports. It looked out of place there. It also felt necessary. He sat in the chair and stared at it longer than he meant to. For years, he had believed that life was something you controlled or endured. He was beginning to suspect there was a third option. Across the city, Annie slept deeply, her dreams uninterrupted, and Ruth lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, wondering when hope had started to feel less dangerous. Monday morning returned the world to its proper distance. Daniel's driver took the familiar route downtown, traffic thick with impatience and routine. The city no longer carried the softness of the weekend. Horns replaced birds, faces hardened into purpose. By the time the car pulled beneath the glass tower that housed his offices, Daniel felt the old weight settle comfortably back onto his shoulders. This was where he belonged. At least, this was where he knew how to function. Inside, everything moved with quiet efficiency. Assistants greeted him by name. Elevators opened before he reached them. Coffee appeared at the precise temperature he preferred. The machinery of his life resumed without question. Yet even as he walked into the boardroom, his mind returned uninvited to a small apartment with peeling paint, to a child's drawing tucked into the inner pocket of his briefcase. The meeting began on time. Forecasts, acquisitions, risk assessments. Daniel spoke when necessary, listened when it mattered, steered conversations with practiced restraint. No one noticed the moments when his attention drifted, when a phrase landed differently than it would have a week ago. Family impact, long-term stability, community response. He had used these terms for years without attaching faces to them. By late afternoon, the building's lights reflected the gray sky outside, trapping the day in an endless twilight. Daniel stood at his window, phone in hand, considering a message he had typed and erased twice. He did not send it. Across the city, Ruth walked Annie to school, her grip on her daughter's hand a fraction tighter than usual. "You're quiet," Annie observed. "So are you," Ruth replied. Annie shrugged. "I'm thinking," Ruth smiled faintly. "About birds again?" "About Daniel," Annie said simply. Ruth stopped walking. They stood at the corner, the crosswalk light blinking red. Cars rushed past, indifferent. "What about him?" Ruth asked carefully. Annie rocked back on her heels. "He didn't come yesterday." It was Sunday, Ruth said. People have lives. I know, Annie replied. I just noticed. The light changed. They crossed. At school, Annie turned back before entering the building. He won't disappear, right? Ruth knelt, meeting her daughter's eyes. No one can promise that, she said gently. But you'll be okay either way. I bet. Annie nodded, though the answer didn't fully satisfy her. Ruth watched her go, a familiar ache settling in her chest. She had worked hard to teach her daughter resilience. She had not intended to teach her how to brace for loss so early. That evening, Daniel arrived home later than usual. He set his briefcase down, loosened his tie, and stood there, staring at the quiet apartment. He did not go back out. He told himself it was discipline, boundaries. He had already blurred them enough. Still, when he sat down to eat alone, he found himself pushing food around his plate, appetite dulled by a sense of unfinished business. The next day passed the same way. On Wednesday, a news alert flashed briefly across a screen in the hallway. Daniel's company mentioned alongside another acquisition. A photograph accompanied the article. Daniel, expression controlled, impeccable as ever. Ruth saw it later that night while scrolling on her phone, Annie asleep beside her. She studied the image longer than she meant to. He looked untouchable there, distant, like a man who belonged to a different story altogether. She set the phone aside, feeling foolish for having expected anything else. On Thursday afternoon, Daniel received a call from his mother. I saw the article, she said, without preamble. Congratulations. Thank you, Daniel replied. You're working too much again, she added. Your wife would have said the same. Relita tent. The mention still landed like a quiet blow. She's not here to say it. Daniel replied evenly. There was a pause. You sound distracted, his mother said. Is everything all right? Daniel thought of Annie feeding birds, of Ruth's careful gaze, of a bench on New Year's Eve. Yes, he said. Everything's fine. The lie tasted familiar. That night, Ruth found herself standing at the window longer than necessary, watching the street below. Annie sat at the table, drawing again. He's busy, Annie said suddenly. Without looking up, Ruth turned. What? He's busy, Annie repeated. That's why he didn't come. Ruth walked over and rested a hand on her daughter's shoulder. You don't know that, Annie shrugged. It makes sense. Ruth felt something twist inside her, not disappointment, but relief mixed with sadness. Children filled silence with logic when adults failed to explain. Friday came and went. Daniel signed documents, approved budgets, attended a charity dinner where people spoke passionately about children they had never met. He smiled at the right moments, said the right things, excused himself early. As he rode the elevator down alone, his phone vibrated. A message, unknown number. He stopped walking and opened it. It was a photo. A child's drawing 3 figures under a crooked street lamp. This time, the tall one held the small one's hand. Below it, a single line of text. She wanted me to show you. Daniel closed his eyes. For a long moment, he stood there as the elevator doors opened and closed around him, unnoticed. Then he typed back, "Thank you for sharing it." There was no immediate reply. Daniel slipped his phone back into his pocket and stepped out into the night. The city felt colder than usual, sharper around the edges, but beneath that, something steadier was taking shape. He drove home without turning on the radio. For the first time, distance did not feel like safety. It felt like avoidance. Daniel did not go to the apartment that night. He drove past the turn, hands tightening on the wheel as if the road itself were testing him. The building slipped out of view, replaced by taller structures, brighter lights, places where no one noticed who came or went. Avoidance, he told himself, was not cruelty. It was clarity. He arrived home later than usual and poured a drink he barely touched. Annie's drawing lay on his desk. The second one now, the version where the tall figure held the small one's hand. He studied it longer than he intended, tracing the crooked street lamp with his eyes. Holding a hand was easy, he thought. Staying was not. The next morning, the weather turned. Rain fell in a steady, gray sheet, flattening the city's edges and muting its sounds. Daniel watched it from his office window while a junior executive delivered a report he barely heard. "Daniel?" the man prompted. "Yes," Daniel said, refocusing. "Go on." But the rain followed him through the day. tapping at the glass. Persistent, patient. Across town, Ruth hurried Annie along the sidewalk, one hand gripping an umbrella, the other gripping her daughter's backpack strap. "You'll be late," Annie observed calmly. "Yes," Ruth replied. "That happens when it rains." Annie glanced back at the street behind them. "He won't come today," she said. Ruth stopped under the awning of the school entrance. "Why do you think that?" "Rain makes people cancel things," Annie replied. "It's not personal." Ruth felt the familiar ache rise again. "You're very understanding." Annie shrugged. "Understanding hurts less." The words lingered with Ruth long after Annie disappeared into the building. That evening, Daniel attended a fundraiser he had committed to months ago. The room was full of polished smiles and carefully moderated compassion. He shook hands, listened to speeches about opportunity and resilience, nodded when expected. A woman beside him leaned in. "You're very quiet tonight." "I'm thinking," Daniel replied. "Dangerous habit," she joked. He smiled politely and excused himself early. On the drive home, traffic slowed to a crawl near the park. Daniel's gaze drifted, unbidden, to the familiar stretch of green beyond the road. The bench was visible through the rain, slick and empty. He pulled over. The rain soaked his coat almost immediately as he stepped out. But he didn't hurry. He walked to the bench and sat, the cold seeping through the fabric, grounding him. This was where it had started, not with hope, with a question. "Sir, would you be my dad?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He had spent days convincing himself that distance was kindness, that restraint was responsibility. Yet, sitting there alone, the logic felt thin. He stood abruptly, rain dripping from his sleeves, and returned to his car. Ruth was drying dishes when the knock came, sharp against the steady patter of rain. She froze. For a split second, annoyance flared. For another, caution. She wiped her hands and moved toward the door, heart beating faster than she liked. When she opened it, Daniel stood there, soaked, hair darkened by rain, expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I should have called." "Do I?" Ruth stared at him, a dozen responses competing for space. "You're wet," she said finally. "Yes," he replied. She stepped aside. "Come in before you catch something." Annie appeared in the hallway, eyes widening. "You came in the rain." Daniel smiled faintly. "I did." She nodded, approving. "That means you wanted to." Ruth shot her a look. "Annie, it's okay," Daniel said. "She's not wrong." Ruth closed the door and handed him a towel. "You didn't have to come." "I know," he said, "but I kept thinking about leaving." "And?" she asked. "And it didn't feel right." They moved into the living room. Annie climbed onto the couch, tucking her feet beneath her, watching him with quiet attention. Ruth leaned against the counter. "You disappeared," she said. Not accusing, just stating a fact. "I did," Daniel admitted, "because I was afraid of doing more harm than good." Ruth crossed her arms. "And now?" "And now I'm afraid of the opposite." They dated. Silence settled, heavy but honest. Annie broke it. "You didn't promise," she said to Daniel. "You said you wouldn't." "I remember," he replied. She nodded. That was good. Ruth exhaled slowly. "Annie doesn't need consistency from someone who can't give it," she said. "I won't let her learn to wait for people who disappear." Daniel met her gaze. "Then don't let me disappear quietly," he said. "Tell me to leave if that's what's safer." 82 thous. Ruth studied him for a long moment. Rain streaking down the window behind him. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. Annie slid off the couch and approached him, stopping a careful distance away. "You can sit," she said, gesturing to the chair. "We're doing homework." Daniel sat. They worked in companionable quiet. Annie solved math problems, occasionally glancing up to see if he was still there. Ruth moved around the kitchen, listening, measuring the rhythm of the room. When Annie finished, she packed her books away and yawned. "Will you come tomorrow?" she asked. Daniel did not answer immediately. Ruth held her breath. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like yet," Daniel said carefully. "But if I come, it won't be by accident." Annie considered that, then smiled. "Okay, Ruth walked him to the door later, the rain finally easing. "You don't owe us anything," she said quietly. "I know," Daniel replied. "That's why I'm choosing it." "Oh," she nodded, accepting the distinction. As he stepped into the hallway, Ruth added, "Just don't make her fill in silence with excuses." Daniel paused. "I won't." Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. Daniel walked to his car, feeling lighter, not because things were resolved, but because they were finally being named. Back upstairs, Annie climbed into bed and whispered into the dark. He came back. "Aub." Ruth stood in the doorway, listening to her daughter's breathing slow, wondering how something so uncertain had already begun to matter. And across the city, Daniel drove home knowing that distance, once his refuge, had become a question he could no longer answer by staying away. The first thing Daniel noticed the next morning was how early he woke up, not because of an alarm, not because of anxiety, but because his mind, restless and alert, refused to sink back into the familiar fog of routine. Gray light pressed against the windows, soft and unassuming. For once, he did not reach for his phone. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying Ruth's words. "Just don't make her fill in silence with excuses." Daniel had spent most of his adult life mastering silence. He used it in boardrooms, in negotiations, in grief. Silence had been his shield. Now, for the first time, he wondered who paid the cost of it. He showered, dressed, and left the apartment earlier than usual. At the office, the day unfolded with mechanical precision. Emails, meetings, decisions that moved money and people like pieces on a board. Daniel performed his role flawlessly, but something fundamental had shifted. Each time a conversation paused, he noticed it. Each time someone avoided saying what they meant, he felt it. At noon, his assistant knocked lightly on his door. "You have lunch with the investment group at 1, she said. "And a call with legal at 3. Daniel nodded. "Cancel lunch." She hesitated. "Reschedule?" "No," he said. "Cancel." The word felt heavier than it should have. Liberating, too. Across town, Ruth folded laundry with deliberate focus. Annie sat at the table, coloring, her feet hooked around the chair legs. "He said tomorrow wouldn't be an accident," Annie said. Ruth paused mid-fold. "He did. That means he's thinking," Annie continued. "Thinking people sometimes stay." Ruth smiled despite herself. "Sometimes." Annie tilted her head. "Are you scared?" Ruth considered the question carefully. "Yes," she said. "But being scared doesn't always mean stop." Annie nodded, accepting that as truth. That afternoon, Daniel stood outside the school building 10 minutes early. He had parked a block away, unwilling to draw attention, and now leaned against the car, watching parents gather in small, distracted clusters. He felt conspicuous in his coat and polished shoes, but no one seemed to notice him. When the doors opened, children poured out in a chaotic rush. Annie emerged near the middle, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders. She spotted him almost immediately and froze. Her face changed not into excitement, but into something quieter, relief. She walked toward him slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might undo the moment. "You came," she said. "I said I wouldn't let it be an accident," Daniel replied. She nodded, satisfied. "Mom said it was okay." Ruth appeared a moment later, her expression cautious but open. "Hello," she said. "Hello," Daniel replied. "I thought I'd walk you home, if that's still all right." Ruth studied him briefly, then nodded. "All right. I do." They walked together, Annie between them, swinging her arms slightly wider than usual. "How was school?" Daniel asked. Annie shrugged. "Math was boring. Reading was better." "What did you read?" "A story about a bear who didn't want to sleep," Annie said. He was afraid he'd missed something. Daniel felt the irony settle gently. "Did he?" "No," Annie said. But he was still tired. Ruth glanced at Daniel. "Sounds familiar." He smiled faintly. At the apartment, Ruth set water to boil while Annie dropped her backpack by the door. "You don't have to stay," Ruth said. "More habit than intention." "I know," Daniel replied. "But I can." She nodded. As Annie worked on her homework, Ruth finally asked the question she had been circling for days. "What is it you want, Daniel?" The room felt smaller as he considered his answer. I want to be honest, he said slowly. With you, with her, with myself. That's vague, Ruth replied. I know, he said. Because the specifics scare me. Ruth leaned against the counter. You're not the only one. Daniel looked at Annie, hunched over her notebook, lips moving as she counted quietly. I don't want to be someone who appears when it feels good and disappears when it's hard, he said. I've been that man before. Ruth's voice softened. And what are you now? I'm trying to be someone different, he replied. But I don't know how that looks yet. Ruth considered him for a long moment. Different doesn't mean permanent, she said. It means present. Daniel nodded. That I can do. That evening, as he prepared to leave, Annie followed him to the door. You came like you said, she said. Yes, that matters, she added. It did. As Daniel stepped into the hallway, he felt the familiar pull of retreat and resisted it. He did not rush. He did not promise. He simply stayed present until it was time to go. Later, alone in his apartment, Daniel placed Annie's drawings side by side on his desk. The crooked street lamp, the joined hands, evidence of something growing without permission. He sat back, hands resting on the armrests, and allowed himself a thought he had avoided since his wife's death. What if staying was not a risk but a responsibility? Across town, Ruth lay awake, listening to Annie's steady breathing, wondering how a man who moved through the world with such control could also carry so much hesitation. And Annie, drifting toward sleep, held onto a simple truth she had learned early and well. People who come back mean more than people who promise. Saturday arrived without ceremony. No meetings, no deadlines, no alarms slicing through the morning. Daniel woke to pale sunlight and the unfamiliar feeling of having nowhere he was required to be. For years, weekends had been placeholders, empty spaces between obligations he filled with work, or travel, or nothing at all. Today, he filled it with hesitation. He stood in his kitchen, coffee growing cold in his hand, and stared at his phone. He had already checked the time twice, as if punctuality could justify uncertainty. Present doesn't mean permanent, Ruth had said. Daniel exhaled slowly and picked up his coat. Across the city, Annie was already awake. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sorting through her books with exaggerated seriousness. Is he coming today? She asked without looking up. Ruth, standing at the stove, paused only a fraction of a second. He didn't say, Is Vetter about us too? Annie nodded, accepting the answer, but not the implication. Okay. Ruth watched her daughter carefully. No disappointment, no visible hope, just readiness for either outcome. At 10 minutes past 10, the knock came. Ruth closed her eyes briefly before opening the door. Daniel stood there, holding a paper bag in one hand, uncertainty written plainly across his face. I brought pastries, he said. I didn't know what kind you like. Ruth stepped aside. That's usually how it works. Annie appeared behind her, eyes widening. You came. Daniel smiled faintly. I said I wouldn't make it an accident. She nodded, as if checking off a box only she could see. They ate at the small table, crumbs scattered between them, sunlight warming the chipped surface. Daniel listened as Annie explained the difference between weekend reading and school reading, a distinction Ruth admitted she had never fully understood. You don't read on weekends? Annie asked Daniel. I do, he said. But it's mostly numbers pretending to be words. She frowned. That sounds boring. It usually is. After breakfast, Ruth gathered her keys. I need to run errands, she said. Groceries, laundry, nothing exciting. I can come, Annie said immediately. Ruth looked at Daniel, measuring. Would you be all right staying here? Daniel nodded. If Annie is, Annie was already heading for the couch with her blanket. Ruth hesitated at the door. We'll be back in an hour. We'll be here, Daniel said. When the door closed, the apartment felt different, quieter, more exposed. Annie sat beside him, legs tucked beneath her. She turned on the television but muted it, watching the images without sound. You're not leaving, right? She asked, casually, as if inquiring about the weather. No, Daniel replied. I'm not. She leaned back against the cushion. Okay, HD. They sat like that for a while, comfortable in silence. Daniel found himself watching the way she focused, the seriousness with which she existed in the world. "Why don't you like promises?" she asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. "What makes you think that?" "You didn't promise," she said. "Grown-ups usually promise when they want to make people feel better." Daniel considered that. "Promises can make people feel better," he said, "but they can also make things worse if you can't keep them." Annie thought about that. "So you don't promise because you don't want to lie?" "Yes," he said simply. She nodded, satisfied. "That's better." When Ruth returned, she found them sitting on the floor, a half-finished puzzle between them. Daniel looked up, startled, as if he had forgotten time could pass unnoticed. "You didn't have to stay so long," Ruth said. "I didn't notice," Daniel replied. That evening, they walked to the park together. The same bench waited beneath the bare trees, ordinary now in daylight. "You sit here," Annie instructed Daniel, pointing. He obeyed. She climbed up beside him, feet swinging, mirroring that first night without knowing it. Ruth stood nearby, watching the two of them in careful alignment. "You came back," Ruth said quietly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Because leaving started to feel like a choice I was making for the wrong reasons." 3014, Ruth studied him. "And staying? That feels like responsibility," he said. "Not ownership, not rescue, just showing up." Ruth nodded slowly. "That's the right word." As the afternoon faded, Annie grew quiet, her energy spent. Daniel walked them home, matching his steps to hers. At the door, Annie turned to him. "Today was good," she said. "It was," he agreed. "Tomorrow might be different," she added. "Yes," she smiled. "But you came today." Away. Ruth watched as Daniel stepped back, giving space without withdrawing. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked. "For not confusing presence with control." Daniel nodded once. "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me try." That night, back in his apartment, Daniel realized something subtle but undeniable. He was no longer measuring his life by what he avoided. He was measuring it by what he chose. The first crack did not arrive loudly. It came disguised as an invitation. Daniel found it waiting in his inbox on Monday morning. Nestled between quarterly reports and legal briefs, an elegant email written in careful language, congratulating him on recent successes and requesting his presence at a private dinner later that week. The guest list, it promised, would be select, influential, important. He stared at the screen longer than necessary. Normally, he accepted these things without thought. These rooms were familiar territory, places where power gathered quietly, where people spoke in half sentences and understood one another perfectly, places where his name opened doors before he reached them. This time, his first instinct was not interest, it was distance. Across town, Ruth stood at the kitchen sink, watching steam rise from a pot of boiling water. Annie sat at the table, practicing spelling words, her voice steady as she sounded each one out. "Permanent," Annie read carefully. "PER. Ruth smiled faintly. "That's a hard one." Annie frowned. "It means something stays." "Yes," Ruth said. "It does." Annie nodded, then added, "Some things don't have to stay forever to matter." Ruth paused, her hand tightening slightly around the spoon. That evening, Daniel came by later than usual. He looked tired, not the polished fatigue of long meetings, but something heavier, quieter. He removed his coat slowly, as if the simple act required more effort than before. "You're late," Annie observed. "I am," Daniel said. "I'm sorry." "That's okay," she replied. "You still came." Ruth watched him carefully. "Long day?" "Yes," Daniel said. Then, after a pause, "Complicated one." They ate dinner together. Conversation gentle but thinner than usual. Daniel listened more than he spoke. When Annie finished and excused herself to read, Ruth poured tea and gestured toward the table. "What's wrong?" she asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I've been invited somewhere." Ruth waited. "A dinner," he continued. "The kind I usually attend." "And?" she asked. "And I realized I didn't want to," he said. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "That's new." "Yes," he admitted, and it unsettles me more than wanting to go would. She leaned back in her chair. Why? Daniel stared into his cup. Because the world I move in doesn't like uncertainty. It prefers clean narratives, clear boundaries. And we're neither, Ruth said quietly. No, Daniel agreed. You're not, Ruth considered him. You don't owe anyone an explanation. I know, he said. But explanations are currency where I come from. Annie padded back into the room, book tucked under her arm. She climbed onto her chair and watched them with quiet interest. Are you arguing? She asked. No, Ruth said. We're talking. Daniel smiled faintly. Adults call it talking when we don't want to admit we're scared. Annie considered that. I get scared when teachers change seats. Ruth laughed softly. Later that night, after Annie was asleep, Daniel stood by the window, looking out at the street below. Ruth joined him, arms folded loosely. They'll notice, she said. Daniel nodded. They already have. You're different lately, she added. People don't like different when they're used to control. Daniel's voice was low. Neither do I. Ruth turned to him. Then why keep doing this? He didn't answer immediately. He thought of the park bench, the drawing, the way Annie's voice softened when she read. Because this feels honest, he said finally. And my life hasn't felt that way in a long time. The dinner arrived on Thursday. Daniel stood in his apartment, tie in hand, staring at his reflection. The invitation lay open on the counter. So did Annie's latest drawing. 4 figures now. The 4th smaller, labeled simply, tomorrow. He picked up his phone and typed a response. Regretfully decline. He sent it before he could reconsider. The consequences were subtle but immediate. A call from an associate, tone curious. A message from his mother, asking if everything was all right. A look from a colleague the next morning that lingered a second too long. Daniel felt it, the shift in air, the recalibration. That evening, he arrived at Ruth's apartment quieter than usual. You didn't go, Ruth said, reading his expression. No, he replied. Why? Because I didn't want to explain you, he said. Or Annie. Or myself. Ruth's breath caught. You don't have to protect us. I know, Daniel said. But I won't offer you up as a curiosity either. Annie looked up from her puzzle. Did you choose us? The question was innocent. The answer was not. Daniel crouched to her level. I chose to be here, he said carefully. She nodded, satisfied. Ruth watched the exchange, something tightening in her chest, not fear this time, but awareness. You're stepping into a different kind of fight, she said later, quietly. Not loud, but constant. Daniel nodded. I know, and it won't always feel kind, she added. I know that too, he said. But it feels necessary. That night, as Daniel left, Ruth stopped him at the door. I need to say this clearly, she said. If staying starts to cost you more than you're willing to give, I expect you to tell us. Not disappear. Daniel met her gaze. I promise that. It was the first promise he had made. He meant it. As he walked down the stairs, phone vibrating again with messages he did not read, Daniel understood something essential. The danger was no longer that he might leave. The danger was that the world he had built would not easily let him stay. The change announced itself in small, measurable ways. Daniel noticed it first in meetings, the slight hesitation before his colleagues spoke, the careful phrasing that replaced easy familiarity. People listened as they always had, but something in their eyes suggested recalculation. As if he had moved one square to the left on a board no one had told him he was playing on. He did not comment on it. He adjusted. Across town, Ruth felt a similar shift, though hers arrived quietly, without titles or boardrooms to announce it. A neighbor she usually greeted in the stairwell smiled a little less. A coworker asked one too many questions about her new friend. Nothing overt, nothing she could point to and say, there, this is the problem. But it accumulated. On Tuesday evening, Daniel arrived later than usual, his phone buzzing persistently as he shrugged out of his coat. You don't have to answer that, Ruth said, nodding toward the device. I know, he replied, silencing it anyway. But I should. Annie sat on the floor nearby, arranging her puzzle pieces into careful piles. People like to ask questions, she said. Yes, Daniel said, watching her. They do. And sometimes, Annie added, they don't like the answers. Ruth glanced at her daughter, startled. Where did you learn that? Annie shrugged. At school, and from watching, Winby Dull Duck. Daniel felt the truth of it settle uncomfortably. That night, after Annie had gone to bed, Ruth poured 2 cups of tea and set one in front of him. You're carrying this quietly, she said. I'm used to that, Daniel replied. That doesn't mean you should, she said. Daniel stared into the cup. If I speak too loudly, it becomes a spectacle. If I stay quiet, it becomes suspicion. Ruth nodded slowly. Welcome to my world. Well, he looked up at her then, really looked, and saw the years of measured restraint in her eyes, the careful balance between dignity and survival, the habit of absorbing judgment without letting it harden you. I didn't realize how often you had to do this, he said. You weren't supposed to, Ruth replied gently. That's kind of the point. The next day, Daniel's mother called again. You've been difficult to reach, she said. I've been busy, he replied. With what? She asked. Daniel hesitated. With living, he said finally. There was a pause on the line. You sound defensive. I'm not, he said. I'm deliberate. His mother sighed. People are talking. They always do, Daniel replied. This time, they're wondering why you've changed, she said. Why you've withdrawn. Daniel thought of Annie reading aloud. Of Ruth's steady presence. Of the quiet strength it took to be seen without armor. Maybe I have, he said. That worries me, his mother replied. It doesn't worry me, Daniel said softly. That evening, Ruth came home later than usual, exhaustion etched plainly into her posture. She set her bag down and leaned against the counter for a moment longer than necessary. Long day? Daniel asked. Yes, she replied. And a complicated one. He nodded. Me too. Annie appeared from the hallway, sensing the shift. Are we still having dinner together? Ruth smiled faintly. Yes, sweetheart. We are. Dinner that night was quieter, not strained, just thoughtful. Each of them seemed aware that something invisible was moving around them, testing the edges of what they had built. Afterward, Annie brought out a sheet of paper and crayons. I'm making a map, she announced. A map of what? Daniel asked. Of where people belong, she said, matter-of-factly. Ruth and Daniel exchanged a look. Annie drew 3 circles close together, then added lines connecting them. Around the edges, she drew smaller shapes, houses, trees, paths. This is ours, she said, pointing to the center. The rest is the world. Daniel felt his chest tighten. That's a nice map, Ruth said carefully. Annie nodded. Maps help you remember where to go back to. Later, as Daniel prepared to leave, Ruth walked him to the door. They're starting to notice, she said quietly. The world you come from. Daniel nodded. I know. And when they do, she continued, they don't usually ask permission. I won't let them make you collateral, he said. Ruth met his gaze. Just make sure you don't make us invisible either. He understood what she meant. Protection that erased agency was just another form of control. I won't, he said. That night, alone in his apartment, Daniel reviewed emails he had avoided all day. Questions disguised as concerns, invitations framed as obligations, warnings that wore the mask of advice. He closed his laptop without responding. Instead, he pulled Annie's map from his briefcase. She had insisted he take a copy. 3 circles, connected. He stared at it for a long time, aware that the choice he was making no longer belonged only to him. Across town, Ruth lay awake listening to the city settle, wondering when the quiet would break and from which direction. And Annie slept with the map folded beneath her pillow, confident in a logic only children could hold so clearly. Belonging was not about permission. It was about staying when staying became visible. The invitation did not arrive by email. It came printed on heavy paper, delivered by hand to Daniel's office late Thursday afternoon. His assistant placed it on his desk without comment, but her eyes lingered a fraction too long, as if gauging his reaction. Daniel did not open it right away. He finished reviewing a proposal, signed his name with steady precision, and dismissed the room. Only when the door closed did he pick up the envelope. His name was embossed in dark blue ink. The message inside was brief polite, and unmistakably strategic. A private reception, limited attendance, an opportunity to reconnect. Daniel folded the card once and set it aside. That evening, he arrived at Ruth's apartment quieter than usual, his coat still buttoned, as if he had not fully decided whether to stay. Annie sat on the floor with her map spread out again, adding details with intense focus. "You look tired," Ruth said. "I am," Daniel replied. "But not from work. Where did I?" Ruth waited. "They're pushing," he said finally. More directly now. Ruth nodded slowly. "I wondered when that would happen." Annie looked up. "Who's they?" Daniel crouched beside her. "People who don't like change," he said. She considered that. "Change happens anyway." "Yes," he said. "That's what scares them." Later, after Annie had gone to bed, Daniel showed Ruth the invitation. She read it once, then again. "This isn't just social," she said. "It's a test." "As a tension." "Yes," Daniel replied. "They want to see where I stand." "And where do you?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. "Here," he said. "But I don't know what that costs yet." Ruth met his gaze. "It will cost you comfort," she said. "And it may cost us privacy." Daniel nodded. "I won't bring anything to your door you didn't agree to." Ruth appreciated that more than she said. The reception took place the following evening in a restored townhouse downtown. The rooms were warm with light and quiet conversation. Daniel moved through them with familiar ease, shaking hands, accepting nods of recognition. He did not linger. Questions came, subtle and pointed. "You've been difficult to pin down lately. New priorities? Still planning that expansion overseas?" Daniel answered selectively. He did not volunteer. He did not retreat. At one point, a man he had known for years leaned in and said quietly, "People notice who you're seen with." "I want—" Daniel met his eyes. "Then they should look more carefully." The man smiled thinly. "Careful cuts both ways." When Daniel left, he felt the weight of the night settle onto his shoulders not as dread, but as clarity. Across town, Ruth paced the apartment while Annie slept, the invitation's implications echoing in her mind. She had lived her life outside rooms like that, but she knew their power. She knew how narratives were shaped long before anyone was asked for consent. The next morning, a photograph appeared online. Daniel recognized it instantly. He was captured mid-conversation at the reception, expression composed, posture unmistakably his. The headline beneath it was careful, almost complimentary. But the implication was clear: a return to form, a reassurance to those watching. Daniel closed the article and set his phone down. That afternoon, Ruth received a message from a coworker she barely knew well enough to call a friend. "Saw this. Is that him?" Ruth stared at the screen longer than necessary before typing back. "Yes." The reply came quickly. "Thought so. Must be nice." Ruth set the phone aside, a familiar mixture of irritation and resolve settling in her chest. She refused to explain herself to shadows. That evening, Daniel arrived earlier than usual. He removed his coat and hung it carefully, a gesture Ruth recognized as restraint. "They're shaping the story," he said, without asking. Ruth nodded. "They always do," I said. Annie emerged from her room, rubbing her eyes. "Why is everyone quiet?" Daniel knelt. "Because sometimes grown-ups need to choose words carefully." She frowned. "You didn't choose words with me." "No," he said. "I chose truth." She smiled sleepily. "That's better." Later, Ruth and Daniel stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. "I don't want her learning that belonging means hiding," Ruth said quietly. "It won't," Daniel replied. "Not if I can help it." Was not again. "And if you can't?" she asked. "Then I'll tell you," he said. "Before it costs more than it should." Ruth studied his face. "That's all I ask." That night, Daniel did not go home right away. He walked the city instead, letting the noise and light remind him of how easily people disappeared into patterns they didn't choose. He thought of Annie's map. 3 circles, connected, no labels for rank or permission. When he finally reached his apartment, he sat at his desk and began to write not emails, not responses, but a list. What he was willing to lose, what he was not. At the top, without hesitation, he wrote one name, then another. Across town, Ruth tucked Annie in again, smoothing her hair back. "Are we okay?" Annie asked. "Yes," Ruth said, with more certainty than she felt. "We are." Annie nodded and drifted to sleep. Outside, the city carried on, unaware that lines had been drawn quietly, deliberately, by people who had learned that staying visible was sometimes the bravest choice of all. The first confrontation arrived without raised voices. It came wrapped in civility. Daniel was halfway through his morning briefing when his assistant leaned in, her tone carefully neutral. "Your mother is on line 2. She says it's important." Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest. "Put her through." He dismissed the room and waited until the door closed. "I saw the photograph," his mother said without greeting. "Yes," Daniel replied. "I assumed you would. I am as—" "You didn't tell me you were going," she continued. "You've been distant." "I've been deliberate," Daniel said. A pause, then, softer. "People are asking questions." "They always do," he replied. "This time, the questions are about you," she said. "About what you're aligning yourself with." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I'm not in alignment." "That's a luxury you used to have," his mother said. "Not anymore." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "What is it you want from me?" "I want to understand," she replied. "Why you're risking so much for something so undefined." Daniel thought of a child's careful logic, of a map drawn in crayon. "Because what I was protecting before was empty," he said. Silence followed. "Not angry. Measuring. Be careful," his mother said finally. "The world doesn't forgive men who change the rules without permission." Daniel ended the call without argument. Across town, Ruth sat in a meeting room at work, hands folded, listening as a supervisor spoke in polished generalities about optics and community perception. The words drifted past her with practiced familiarity. She had heard versions of this speech before. "We value diversity," the woman said, "but we also have to be mindful of how relationships are perceived." Ruth met her gaze calmly. "My personal life doesn't interfere with my work." No one said it did," the supervisor replied quickly. "We're just advising caution." Ruth nodded. "I'm very good at caution." She left the meeting without incident, but the message lingered. Visibility had a price. It always had. That evening, Daniel arrived with an unfamiliar expression tight around the mouth, eyes alert in a way Ruth recognized as preparation rather than fear. "They're starting to say it out loud," he said once the door closed. Ruth nodded. "So are mine." "Well," Annie sat at the table, coloring quietly. She looked up at them. "Are we in trouble?" Ruth moved quickly, kneeling in front of her. "No," she said firmly. "We're just being noticed." Annie frowned. "Noticing isn't bad." "No," Daniel said, joining them. "It's not. But sometimes," Annie added, "people notice so they can tell you what to do." Ruth and Daniel exchanged a glance. "Yes," Ruth said. "That happens." Annie considered this. "Do we have to listen?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Sometimes we listen. Sometimes we decide." Later, after Annie had gone to bed, Daniel sat at the small kitchen table, elbows resting on the surface he had come to know by feel. "I don't want this to become a siege," he said quietly. Ruth studied him. "It already is, in small ways." "I can push back," Daniel said. "I have resources, influence." Ruth shook her head. "I don't want to be defended like a territory," she said. "I want to be respected." Daniel nodded. "Then tell me where the line is." Ruth thought for a moment. "No press," she said. "No statements. No using us to make a point." "I wouldn't," he replied immediately. "And if it gets worse?" she asked. "Then we decide together," he said. She searched his face. "You've never had to decide together before." "No," he admitted. "I'm learning." The next day, Daniel declined another invitation, then another. The refusals were polite, reasoned, increasingly difficult to ignore. A columnist mentioned his retreat from public life. A commentator speculated about unusual personal priorities. Daniel read none of it. Instead, he walked Annie home from school on Friday, the three of them moving through the neighborhood with unremarkable normalcy. A neighbor watched from a window a beat too long. A passerby recognized Daniel and slowed. Annie squeezed his hand slightly, not in fear, but awareness. "You don't have to hold my hand," she said. "I know," Daniel replied. "I like it," she added. He kept holding it. That night, Ruth stood at the window, phone in hand. "Someone wants to interview me," she said. Off the record. Daniel turned sharply. "About what?" "About you," she said. "About us." "What did you say?" "I said no," Ruth replied. Without hesitation, Daniel exhaled. "Thank you." Ruth turned to him. "I didn't do it for you," she said. "I did it because my life isn't a footnote." He nodded. "I wouldn't want it to be." Is nodded. They stood there in silence, the city pressing in. Louder now. Across town, Daniel's phone buzzed with a message he had been expecting and dreading. A board member. Brief. Direct. "We need to talk." Daniel did not answer immediately. He sat down at the table, Annie's map spread out between them like a quiet anchor. "I think the quiet part is ending," he said. Ruth nodded. "Then we'll need to be louder." Carefully. See, Daniel looked at her, seeing clearly the strength that had always been there, unacknowledged by rooms he once considered important. "I won't make decisions for you," he said. "And I won't let you fight alone," she replied. In the bedroom, Annie slept peacefully, unaware of the calculations being made on her behalf. She dreamed, perhaps, of 3 circles that did not drift apart when the world pressed in. Outside, the city hummed with speculation and impatience. Inside that small apartment, a different kind of resolve took shape, quiet, mutual, and unafraid of being seen. The meeting was scheduled for 8:30 sharp. Daniel arrived 10 minutes early, as he always did. The boardroom looked unchanged, glass walls, polished table. The city stretched beyond like a promise that had learned how to demand loyalty. He took his seat at the head without ceremony and folded his hands, grounding himself in stillness rather than control. When the others entered, they did so in pairs and singles. Conversation hushed, expressions neutral, familiar faces, people who had watched him build, stumble, rebuild. People who believed they knew the shape of him. The door closed. The room settled. "We appreciate you making time," the chair began, voice smooth. "This won't take long." Daniel nodded. "Good." There it was, a flicker of surprise. He noticed it and did not soften his posture. "You've been declining engagements," another board member said, tapping a pen against a legal pad. "Important ones." "Yes," Daniel replied. "Care to explain?" the chair asked. Daniel leaned back slightly. "I'm prioritizing." Silence followed. Not confusion, calculation. "Your priorities," the chair said carefully, "have implications." "They always have," Daniel replied. A third voice entered, sharper. "We're concerned about perception." Daniel met the speaker's gaze. "Whose?" "Our partners, the press, the public's." Daniel nodded. "I'm aware. And yet," the chair continued, "you're choosing to remain opaque, deeper vens." Daniel allowed a small pause. "I'm choosing to be private." "Those aren't the same," the pen tapper said. "They are when privacy is the point," Daniel replied. The chair folded his hands. "We need assurance that nothing in your personal life compromises the company." Daniel felt the words land, cold and precise. "It doesn't," he said. "What compromises companies is pretending people are liabilities instead of leaders." A murmur followed. Controlled. Uncomfortable. "We're not pretending," the chair said. "We're managing risk." Daniel leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "Then manage this risk with me in the room, not around me." Another silence. "Are you planning to make a public statement?" someone asked. "No," Daniel said. "And I won't. That may not be sustainable," the chair warned. Daniel nodded. Neither is silence that erases people. The meeting ended without resolution. That, Daniel understood, was the point. When he left the building, the air outside felt sharper than usual. He walked for several blocks before allowing himself to breathe fully, phone vibrating in his pocket with messages he did not read. Across town, Ruth sat at the kitchen table, staring at a folded flyer someone had slipped under her door. A community meeting, public forum, discussion of neighborhood changes. She recognized the language. Annie sat beside her, coloring carefully. "You're thinking loud," she observed. Ruth smiled faintly. "Am I?" "Yes," Annie said. "Your eyebrows do that." Ruth laughed softly, then sobered. "How do you feel about people asking questions?" Annie shrugged. "If they ask nicely, it's okay. And if they don't, then they're not really asking," Annie replied. "They're telling." Ruth nodded. "You're right." That evening, Daniel arrived later than planned, his face drawn but steady. "How did it go?" Ruth asked. "As expected," he replied. "They didn't say what they meant. They said what they needed to hear themselves say." "And what did you say?" she asked. "The truth," Daniel replied, without decoration. Annie looked up. "Did it work?" Daniel considered the question. "Not yet," she nodded. "Some things take time." Later, after Annie was asleep, Daniel and Ruth sat at the table, the flyer between them. "They're circling," Ruth said quietly. "Both sides." "Yes," Daniel replied. "And eventually they'll want a line drawn." Ruth met his gaze. "I won't be a symbol." "I know," Daniel said. "I won't let you be." "And Annie?" Ruth asked. Daniel's voice softened. "She's not a lesson for anyone else to learn." Ruth exhaled. Good. Outside, the city buzzed with the low energy of things not yet decided. That night, Daniel returned home and opened his laptop. He drafted a message he had avoided writing: clear, measured, addressed to the board. "I will not comment publicly on my personal life. My performance remains unchanged. Any attempt to frame privacy as liability will be treated as a governance issue." He read it twice, then sent it. Across town, Ruth tucked Annie in, brushing her hair back gently. "Are we still okay?" Annie asked. "Yes," Ruth said. "We are." "And tomorrow?" Ruth smiled. "Tomorrow too." Annie closed her eyes, satisfied. In the quiet that followed, Daniel stood by his window, watching lights blink on and off across the city. He felt no triumph, no dread, only a steady awareness that the easy part was over. Choosing to stay had been the beginning. Choosing to stand would be something else entirely. The story broke on a Tuesday. Not with a headline, those came later, but with a whisper that moved faster than confirmation. By noon, Daniel felt it in the way people looked at him when he stepped out of his car. Not hostile, curious, alert. By evening, it had found its shape. A short article, carefully written, framed as industry insight. It mentioned his recent absences, his refusals, his uncharacteristic withdrawal. It speculated politely about personal influences and shifting values. No names were printed. No accusations made. It was enough. Daniel read it once. Then he closed the page and stood, walking to the window. Below him, the city moved as it always did, indifferent to nuance. Stories did not need truth to travel. They only needed shape. Across town, Ruth learned about it from a friend who texted a link with a single line beneath it. "Is this about him?" Ruth did not open the article right away. She finished washing the dishes first, grounding herself in the ordinary. When she finally read it, her jaw tightened, not in fear, but in recognition. She had seen this before. That evening, Annie noticed the change before either adult spoke. "You're quiet again," she said, looking between them. Daniel forced a small smile. "Thinking." Annie nodded. "Thinking can be loud." Ruth sat down across from him. "It's starting." "Yes," Daniel replied, "but not the way I expected." She studied his face. "Are you angry?" "No," he said after a moment. "I'm resolved." That surprised her. "About what?" "About not correcting every lie," he said, "and not accepting the ones that matter." Annie frowned. "Why don't you just tell them the truth?" Daniel looked at her gently. "Sometimes telling the truth isn't about talking," he said. "It's about what you refuse to do." She considered that. "Like not leaving." "Yes," he said. "Exactly like that." The next morning, Daniel's assistant knocked on his office door. eyes careful. "There are reporters downstairs." "I'm not seeing them," Daniel replied calmly. "And the board?" she asked. "Tell them I'll address governance concerns at the next scheduled meeting," he said. "Not before." She hesitated. "This could escalate." "I know," Daniel said. It did. By afternoon, a second article appeared, then a third. The language sharpened, still polite, still speculative, but now unmistakably pointed. Questions about suitability, about image. Daniel felt the pressure tighten, not on him alone, but on the invisible line connecting him to Ruth and Annie. That evening, he arrived at the apartment earlier than usual. "I need to talk to you," he said as soon as the door closed. Ruth nodded. "So do I." Annie looked up from her book. "Is it bad?" "No," Ruth said firmly. "It's complicated." Daniel crouched in front of Annie. "There are people who don't like that I won't explain my life to them," he said. "They're trying to make that look like a problem." Annie frowned. "Is it?" "No," he said. "But they want it to be." Ruth crossed her arms. "They're testing how much noise it takes to make you step back." Daniel nodded. "Yes, and what happens if you don't?" she asked. "Then they'll get louder," he said. And closer. Silence filled the room, heavy but honest. Ruth broke it first. "I won't let this touch her," she said, nodding toward Annie. "I know," Daniel replied. "I won't either. But I need to ask you something," Ruth said. "And I need you to answer without strategy." Daniel met her gaze. "Go on. If this costs you your position," she said quietly, "will you resent us?" The question landed cleanly, without accusation. Daniel did not answer right away. He thought of the boardroom, the power, the life he had built to survive grief by outrunning it. Then he thought of a park bench. A question asked without leverage. "No," he said finally. "I would resent myself if I left." Ruth exhaled, some tension easing from her shoulders. "Then we're clear." Annie closed her book. "Are you going to lose your job?" Daniel smiled gently. "I don't know." She nodded. "That's okay. My mom doesn't know everything either." Ruth laughed softly despite herself. The next day, Daniel released a statement. It was brief, unremarkable by design. "I will not comment on speculation about my personal life. My responsibilities and performance remain unchanged. Privacy is not an absence of accountability. Nothing more." The reaction was immediate and divided. Some praised restraint. Others criticized evasion. A few voices, louder than expected, spoke about boundaries, about the cost of demanding transparency from people who owed none. Daniel read none of it. Instead, he took the afternoon off and walked Annie home from school, the three of them moving through the neighborhood as usual. Heads turned. A phone lifted briefly. Annie noticed and squeezed his hand. "Are they looking at us?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Do we have to stop?" she asked. "No," he said. "We keep walking." That night, as Annie slept, Ruth and Daniel sat at the table, the weight of the week settling between them. "They'll push until something breaks," Ruth said. "Or until they realize it won't," Daniel replied. She looked at him. "You know this may not end cleanly." "I do," he said. "But I also know this isn't a mistake." Ruth nodded slowly. "Neither is choosing not to hide." Outside, the city buzzed with opinion and impatience. Inside that small apartment, something steadier held, not certainty, commitment, and somewhere between the noise and the quiet, the line was finally clear. The vote was scheduled for Friday, not announced publicly, not framed as a verdict. It appeared on Daniel's calendar as a special session, tucked between routine governance items, its weight disguised by procedural language. Daniel knew better. He arrived at the building earlier than usual, and sat alone in his office with the lights still dim. The city outside was just waking, its rhythm untroubled by the quiet decisions that would ripple through it by afternoon. He did not review notes. He did not rehearse arguments. Instead, he opened his phone and looked at a photograph Ruth had sent the night before. Annie, asleep on the couch, her book fallen open on her chest. One arm flung upward in careless trust. The image grounded him in a way no briefing ever had. Across town, Ruth walked Annie to school with unusual slowness. "Why are you walking like that?" Annie asked. "I'm thinking," Ruth replied. "About the loud things?" Annie asked. "Yes, I do's." Annie nodded. "Loud things usually pass." Ruth smiled faintly. "Sometimes they leave marks." "That's okay," Annie said. "Scars mean you healed." Ruth stopped and crouched, meeting her daughter's eyes. "Where did you learn that?" Annie shrugged. "From stories." At the office, the boardroom filled gradually. The atmosphere was formal but restrained, tension hidden beneath politeness. Daniel took his seat without ceremony, acknowledging greetings with nods rather than words. The chair began promptly. "We're here to discuss leadership continuity," he said. In light of recent developments, Daniel listened without interruption as concerns were raised: brand stability, partner confidence, reputational risk. The words were familiar, the framing precise. Finally, the chair turned to him. "Daniel, would you like to respond?" Daniel stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. "I understand the concerns," he said, "but I reject the premise." Rated O's. A ripple moved through the room. "My performance has not changed," he continued. "Our metrics are strong, our strategy intact. What has changed is that I no longer mistake silence for obligation." The pen tapper shifted. "This isn't about obligation, it's about perception." Daniel nodded. "Perception improves when leadership has boundaries." Another voice cut in. "This isn't the time for philosophy." Daniel met the speaker's gaze. "It's always the time for governance." Silence followed. "You're asking us to accept ambiguity," the chair said. "I'm asking you to accept reality." Daniel replied. "That leaders are people, that privacy is not misconduct, and that using pressure to extract narratives is a failure of oversight." The chair folded his hands. "And if the vote doesn't go your way?" Daniel paused. "Then I'll leave knowing I didn't trade my integrity for comfort." The vote was taken without drama. Numbers recorded, decisions sealed. When it ended, the chair cleared his throat. "The board has decided to initiate a transition." Daniel nodded once. He had expected no less. There was no applause, no condemnation, only the quiet settling of consequence. Daniel gathered his things, stood, and thanked them for their time. He left the room without looking back. Outside, the city was brighter than he expected. The air felt cleaner, sharper. He walked several blocks before calling Ruth. "It happened," he said. There was a pause on the line. Then steady, "Are you okay?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "I am," she exhaled. "Then we are." That afternoon, news spread quickly. Headlines framed it as a strategic transition. Speculation layered atop official language. Some praised his principles, others questioned his judgment. Daniel did not comment. Instead, he stood outside Annie's school at the familiar spot, hands in his pockets, waiting. When she emerged and saw him, she frowned slightly. "It's not your day." "I know," he said. "But I wanted to walk you home." She studied his face. "Did the loud thing happen?" "Yes. And I stayed," he said. She nodded. "Good." At the apartment, Ruth listened as Daniel explained without bitterness, without drama. "They chose safety over trust," he said. Ruth nodded. "Institutions often do. And I chose people," he added. Ruth met his gaze. "So did I." That evening, they ate together quietly, not solemnly, just present. Annie told a long story about a classmate who'd learned to apologize properly. Daniel listened as if it were a case study in governance. Later, after Annie was asleep, Daniel stood by the window again. But this time, Ruth stood beside him. "I don't know what comes next," he said. Ruth leaned her shoulder lightly against his arm. "Neither do I. That scares me," he admitted. "It should," she replied. "But it doesn't mean it's wrong," he nodded. "I don't regret it." "Good," Ruth said, "because neither do we." Daniel turned to her. "I don't want to drift now. I don't want to become occasional." Ruth met his eyes. "Then don't." "I want to build something quieter," he said. "Slower, with room for mistakes." Ruth smiled. "That sounds like a life." In the bedroom, Annie stirred and called softly. "Mom?" Ruth went to her, returned a moment later smiling. "She asked if you're still here tomorrow." Daniel laughed quietly. "Tell her yes. I was not have come." Outside, the city adjusted to a new narrative. Already moving on. Inside that small apartment, something settled, not triumph, not loss, but alignment. Daniel had lost a position. He had gained a place. Spring arrived quietly, not with announcements or clean transitions, but with small, undeniable changes. The air warming just enough to loosen coats, the light lingering longer in the evenings, the city's sharp edges softening without asking permission. Daniel noticed it one morning as he walked Annie to school, their steps unhurried, the rhythm of their days no longer dictated by calendars that belonged to someone else. "You're early," Annie said, glancing up at him. "I like walking," Daniel replied. "It gives the day room to start." She nodded, as if this were obvious. They reached the school gate. Annie paused, studying him with the seriousness she reserved for questions that mattered. "You're still here," she said. "Yes," Daniel answered. "Not because you have to," she added. "Because I choose to," he said. She smiled, satisfied, and ran ahead without looking back. Across town, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The window was open. Somewhere nearby, a radio played softly. Life. Unremarkable and full. Daniel had moved slowly since the vote. Not retreating, rebuilding, consulting selectively, turning down offers that felt like replacements instead of possibilities. He had learned the difference. That afternoon, he returned from a meeting that had ended early by choice and found Ruth on the couch with papers spread around her. "You're home," she said, surprised. "I finished," he replied. She studied his face. "You look lighter." "I feel like myself," he said. For the first time in a long time, they did not rush to define what they were. They had learned that clarity grew best without pressure. Later, they picked Annie up together and walked to the park. The bench waited beneath the trees, worn and ordinary. Annie climbed onto it and patted the space between them. "You should sit," she instructed. They did. "Do you remember?" Annie asked. "The first night?" Daniel nodded. "I do." "You stopped," she said. "That's why I asked." Ruth looked at her. "Asked what?" Annie swung her legs gently. "If he wanted to be my dad." Ruth inhaled slowly, 1,000 emotions moving through her at once. Daniel did not interrupt. "I didn't mean forever," Annie continued. "I meant here." Daniel smiled. "I know." Ruth placed her hand over Annie's. "You don't ask people to fill holes," she said gently. "You let them choose to stay." Annie nodded. "He chose." "Yes," Ruth said. "He did." That evening, as they walked home, Daniel spoke quietly. "I don't want to replace anyone," he said. "I don't want to rewrite your past." Ruth met his gaze. "I don't want that either. I want to build forward," he continued. Carefully, with permission. Ruth stopped walking. The city moved around them, indifferent and alive. "You have it," she said. They did not announce anything. They did not need to. Weeks passed. Then months. Daniel found work that fit his new boundaries. Ruth advanced at her own pace, no longer apologizing for visibility. Annie grew steadily, confidently, her world expanding without losing its center. One evening, as summer edged closer, they stood together on the balcony, the city glowing below. "Do you miss it?" Ruth asked. "The old life?" Daniel considered the question honestly. "I miss certainty," he said. "But I don't miss the cost." Ruth nodded. "Certainty is expensive. Too expensive," he agreed. From inside, Annie called. "Can you both come here?" They joined her at the table. She had laid out her map again. Older now, more detailed. The circles were still there, but so were paths leading outward, branching, returning. "This is how it works," she explained. "You go out, you come back. The middle stays." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "That's very wise," Ruth said. Annie shrugged. "Maps help." Later that night, after Annie was asleep, Daniel stood at the window one last time. Not searching, not measuring, just watching. Ruth joined him, resting her head against his shoulder. "We didn't win," she said softly. "No," Daniel replied. "We chose." She smiled. "That's better." He thought of the question that had started everything, asked without expectation, without strategy. "Sir, would you be my dad?" The answer, he realized, had never been a word. It had been every time he stayed. The story reminds us that real responsibility is not proven by titles, wealth, or public approval, but by the quiet decision to stay when walking away would be easier. It teaches that children do not need perfect heroes or grand promises. They need honesty, presence, and consistency. In a world obsessed with image and control, true integrity often looks small. A hand held, a boundary respected, a life chosen without spectacle. The deepest form of justice is not loud or performative. It is the courage to protect human dignity, even when doing so costs comfort, certainty, or power. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only,